And welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 83, season 2, episode 29. It is a special edition as the holiday of Passover is just a few hours away, and wanted to drop in a conversation on a specific topic that relates to the holiday itself. Those of you celebrating, I know those of you in the audience are celebrating Passover. Some of you are celebrating Easter. Some of you in the midst of Ramadan, celebrating all kinds of holidays right about now. And our topic this week, specifically related to the holiday of Passover, particularly storytelling. One wouldn't think that storytelling would be something that fits into the notion of coaching. But the reality of it is that when you spend time with any one individual, team, leader, they're all telling a story. There's a story that they are telling. Sometimes it's compelling and sometimes it's not. And sometimes it has a message and sometimes it doesn't. And so it's important that we have an appreciation of story. In fact, over the last number of weeks, we've been talking here and there about something I call the 4 rights of asking. In the context of fundraising, the notion that there are 4 rights, 4 things to do right in every interaction and exchange to get to success or your greatest success. We talked already about the first right, which was being the right person. We talked also about the third right, which is the right timing. And today we're going to talk about the second right, which is the right the right ask. The ask specifically isn't the call to action, meaning the specific thing that we want the person to do. The ask is the story we are telling. What problem, to use the term that my colleague at work, the creative director at our company, Ramy Rubin, shout out to Ramy, uses all the time, is what's the problem we are trying to solve in this moment? Leave out the specific thing I want or need you to do, but what's the problem? What's the solution? And effectively then, what's the story that we are telling? Because in the truth, we're always telling stories. The holiday of Passover, certainly the night of the seder, when we're gathered around the table, we're telling one of the great stories ever told in history. The history of the Exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt, their redemption, their liberation, their coming to freedom with the interaction or the interceding of God on their behalf in the court of Pharaoh. It's an amazing story. And so it's important to appreciate that at our core, we are very much all about stories. I saw a quote that the most revolutionary technology humanity has ever invented is storytelling. Our ability to share stories, our ability to connect to stories, our ability to remember stories, all part of the prism of storytelling. To be an effective communicator requires the ability to tell a good story. And so it's really crucial that we key into the concept of storytelling. On the night of the holiday itself, there's a specific commandment that's in place, which is not simply to remember the story. You can remember the story in your mind and in your heart. But the commandment specifically on this night is to tell the story. Tell it to yourself, tell it to your loved ones, tell it specifically and most importantly to your children. But tell the story. And then there's an additional line that's added in the text of the evening, which is those who share additional details of the story, that is praiseworthy. There's an additional level or layer that comes into play for a person who tells more about the story, adds more detail to the story, tells it in a unique, maybe different, maybe enlarged, maybe enhanced manner this time than the last time. We'll get back to that again in just a few minutes. That is worthy of praise. And it's not limited to a specific portion of the community. Everyone is part of storytelling. Everyone is part of storytelling. Rabbi Sachs writes in an article in Covenant and Conversation on the portion of the Bible that appears in Exodus known as Bo. The article is called Telling the Story. The idea here is that if a person forgets the story, and specifically the story of freedom, they will eventually lose the freedom itself. When you lose the narrative, when you lose the story, you lose what's attached to it as well. The people of Israel are still in the desert, yet they're commanded, part and parcel of the Exodus experience is telling the story. Why? He writes, because they were not simply just a community of people, a tribe. They're coming about and going about the process of creating a covenantal society. Covenantal societies don't do things simply because they were done before. They're building something. And so retelling the story, handing it to the next generation, he writes, dedicating oneself to continuing the work that earlier generations began, are fundamental to the ethos of such a community, such a society, such a culture. They have a moral vision. They have a purpose. There's something deeper going on. And so they're not simply telling stories for the sake of telling stories. They're telling stories for the sake of that story then passes on to the next generation. That story then remains. That story impacts, not just in history, but it remains as memory. It remains as something that a person themselves can attach to, connect to, be part of, can relate to, can even be in, even if the story actually took place thousands of years ago. And we see it in other communities and other cultures that have attached themselves to the story of the Exodus, that have made the Exodus story of the people of Israel their story as well. It is part and parcel of many, many, many of the slave hymns of the 19th century, 18th and 19th century in the South, in the United States. When Moses was in Egypt land, let my people go. And other similar songs, they were powerful, they were impactful, they were inspiring, they were motivating, they moved people. They kept people believing. And so stories have a lot of elements, and to tell a good story is to require a person to understand and appreciate those good elements. What makes a story good? What makes the message of a story compelling? How do we connect to that story in a way that it's not simply a story that happened to somebody else, but it in fact becomes my story, almost to the point where we sort of feel ourselves there. Many people in the community have the custom to reenact portions of the story of the Exodus at their table. I heard this week in a talk by a rabbi that it was his custom in his house with his children that he would reenact year over year the story of the 10 plagues that took place in Egypt. We used to do that at our table. When the kids were little, we'd have different figurines and dolls and things that we would bring to the table to enhance the experience, to make it more tangible and real, and then also something that can commit to memory so that it stays with them into the future. And this attaches on a deep level to a notion brought up in an article that I heard about a long time ago and then heard about again recently in another podcast by a good friend of mine, Rabbi David Bashevkin, has a wonderful podcast called the 1840 Podcast. And there, a couple weeks ago, he brought on Bruce Feiler, the author, who's written some fantastic books. One of my favorites is Walking the Bible, where he took a journey through the Middle East and walked through all the locations, in effect, where the different Old Testament stories took place. Really interesting to sort of get a ground level view of those locations physically while reading the Bible through. Wrote an article many years ago called The Stories That Bind Us. The stories that bind us, the stories that keep us together. And in the article, he quotes the research of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Duke. Dr. Duke and Dr. Fivish, I think is the second person name. And the idea that storytelling tends to hold people together. That people who know their family's story are more resilient. They are, in some sense, stronger. they're emotionally more stable when they know the stories of their family. Sort of a surprising sort of thing. And so their research, which is quoted by Mr. Filer in his article, goes obviously much deeper. And he talks about the idea that they have something called the Do You Know test, where it's a set of 20 questions. Do you know X about your father? Do you know Y about your mother? Where they came from, what school they went to, where their parents are from, maybe even to go deeper a little bit. And then if you know that kind of information, when you're able to be aware of that detail about the family, the story of the family, so it was an amazing thing. People who did the best on the Do You Know test was a single best predictor of children's emotional health and happiness. Like, why was that? So Filer mentions that after 9/11, which was subsequent to their initial research, they then went about reconnecting with all the people who participated in the original research to see how they had handled, even if they were not directly involved in 9/11, how they had handled that experience, that tragedy, that trauma. And here's the quote. Once again, the ones who knew more about their families proved to be more resilient, meaning they could moderate the effects of stress. So what's the idea here? What's going on? So Dr. Duke, in his own article, sort of on that subject, isn't simply the idea, he writes, that knowing the facts about a family's story is what works, but it goes deeper. That is sort of the lagging indicator, effectively. By virtue of knowing those details, it actually, when you go one step below the surface, you get to the sense that what's going on here is simply not knowledge of the family, but it's really the processes that exist in the family, he writes. And therefore, by virtue of the processes that exist in the family, that's why they know their history. So what that means is, integral to the family is the notion of communicating information across generations. The person who is passing the information, when that information is being passed. So typically speaking, in the original research, or the idea that having dinner together was something that would actually be of value, right? So the idea that if families have dinner together, and so that would be a predictor. Not exactly the case. Not necessarily that it requires dinner. That's very hard always to do. But if people travel together as a family, if they holiday celebrate together, and so that creates what they call the intergenerational self. And so that the person is connecting to what was and to connecting to what is, and therefore is able to handle what will be. An intergenerational sense of self, that their personal strength, their moral guidance, their fiber, that their essence, their resilience, that makes them strong, that makes them tough, to makes them handle difficulties in life, the single greatest predictor of that was knowing and having knowledge of the family story, which for me only deepens the idea that it's a commandment of sorts. Not of sorts, an actual commandment from the Bible to share and tell the story and to retell the story in great detail. That was the story originally that happened to our ancestors, but as we recite in the Haggadah itself, in the service itself at the seder, that a person has to feel as if it happened to himself or to herself, connecting to the story at a great level. And so it's super important that we appreciate that that's the reality of it, that we have to, we're obligated, that we're required, and that we've tapped into something very deep and very unique and very human, the ability to tell stories, the ability to share the story, the ability for that story to resonate. That story isn't just details. It isn't just the idea that a person can memorize the details of the story. It's the emotional context of that story, the manner in which the story is told. Even if the story is told 100 times over, even if your children mock you, make fun of you for having told you a story once or twice or 3 times or 10, that helps to create the intergenerational self. That helps to pass the story along. Even if they now mouth the words with you to the story that you are telling because you've told it 100 times, it becomes part of them. When you ritualize it, It becomes part of them in the same way that when you ritualize eating a certain food at a holiday meal, when you ritualize some other aspects of it in the preparation leading up to the holiday, in the prayer services potentially, as part of your faith that are part of that holiday. That it's not just story, actually. It's experiential. It's physically involved. So it's mind, body, and soul. It's connecting you to the other person, them to you. The Bible says it explicitly, the idea that when your child shall ask, you shall tell them X and Y and Z. And you should tell it in the first person. This is my story. This happened to me. Partially for the idea that Rabbi Sachs is writing about of covenantal society and community. Partially now for the notion and the idea that it builds the resilience and the strength and the power in the children to create that intergenerational self, to have these very healthy narratives in their lives, to appreciate that the narrative of our family is up and it's down, it's good and it's bad, that it flows and that it ebbs and that it goes up and then it goes down and that it creates and it brings us to the current moment. And so it's important for us to appreciate the notion of what creates great story and how we tell great story, and to appreciate the idea that we have an opportunity of a lifetime every year on the holiday of Passover, and when we simply get together in family to share our family stories. And so I want to tell you simply as an idea that happened many years ago when I was serving as the rabbi of the community. So we had a gentleman in the community. I talked, obviously, around the holidays a lot about the story of Passover and about the seder specifically. And this gentleman came over to me one year and he said he has a lot of anxiety around the holiday of Passover. Like a lot. And so I asked him why. And so he said simply the fact that he had to lead the seder, because he's the head of the household, and the tradition was that the head of the household would lead the seder. He had a lot of anxiety around it. And the reason was because he did not grow up in a religious home. He did not have a very strong religious Jewish background. And so he didn't know the Bible, and he didn't know the rituals, and he didn't have the habits, and he didn't have, any of the sort of behaviors locked down and locked in to who he was. And when he would come to every year to that event, his children knew more than he did because they were growing up in a religious home and they were going to religious schools and they had studied the subject. So he felt very much that with the obligation of a parent to tell the story, that he had nothing to give. So I heard it and felt it on him. You could really feel his angst. And I told him to tell his own story. To tell your children your story. Because your story is the Exodus story. Your story, your personal liberation, your personal freedom, your personal redemptive story, your return to faith, if you want, is the story they need to hear. And no one else can tell that story. And then tell it the next year, but tell it from a slightly different angle. And tell it a third year with maybe an additional detail that you remembered as you thought about it more. Bring the story to life. Bring some of the paraphernalia, memorabilia, the items that your story had to that story. Attach it to the Exodus story. And then you won't have any anxiety anymore. You won't have any stress anymore. You won't feel that anymore. And they'll want to be there because that's the story they need to hear. They want to hear. They have to hear. That's your story. And I said, then, if you want, you can also tell the Exodus story from your perspective. Because one of the key things, and this is sort of the practical side of what we're going to focus on here in the last few seconds of Coaching with the Bible for this Passover holiday, is to try to tell the story differently this year. Try to go to a different message that's embedded in the story. If you read the Pixar Guide to Great Storytelling, so they want it to be simple as a story, but deep as a story, with messages. Not one-level messages, but multi-layered messages. And think about it from different perspectives. I can tell you that from my perspective this year, I'm thinking about the Exodus story from the standpoint of what it must have been like to be in the court of Pharaoh when Moses and Aaron walked in. How did Pharaoh see that moment? How did his advisors experience that? The magicians in the court. Let's take it from their perspective. How does that enhance the story? How does it change the story? I've mentioned it before here in Coaching with the Bible. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And so if we grab onto and attach ourselves to a different perspective of the same exact event, like many fictional narratives are today, many writers write this way. They'll write one chapter from one perspective. They'll write another chapter of the same story from a perspective of a different character in the same book. And it takes on an entire new narrative because now you have richness of detail, you have new perspective, you have backstory that's crucial, context that was lacking, and now it feeds in, fills the cup of that story in a really great way. And so think about the story you want to tell. Make the story in practical sense of how we tell stories. Make that story authentic to you. Make it yours. Make it readily understandable, clear, quick, and understandable. Have it have some sort of vision and urgency attached to it when you want to tell a story that's compelling. And then draw everyone into the story. Make that story about you, but also make it about them. Make it feel like it's their story. You can't tell the story about 1 million people, 2 million people leaving Egypt. It's hard to attach to. But zoom in on that little kid. Zoom in on the magician, on Aaron, on Moses, on one of the leaders, on Moses' sister, Miriam, his parents. Take your pick. But when you do that, the story becomes even more alive. The covenantal society that you're trying to build is even greater. But it's not only true in the biblical sense, in the religious sense, but it's also true in the personal sense. To know your story as essentially the idea of knowing your why, knowing the essence of who you are, tasting your core, your essence of who you are as a being, builds the resilience, builds the strength, and allows you to share that story with the generations that come after you. And it allows you to connect to the great success that's waiting ahead of you after you go on that journey and you head into redemption, liberation, freedom, and ultimately to greater success. That is Coaching with the Bible for this year. I want to wish all of you celebrating all the different holidays this weekend and the coming week. Happy holidays to all of you. See you next week.